Welcome back to the Eau Rouge podcast. It feels like we were here just a few days ago, Chris, because, we were. But today we saw the Spanish Grand Prix, and we are now doing this podcast straight after the race rather than a few days or a week. It's maybe fair to say that this was probably the least exciting race that we've had this season, certainly in terms of on-track battles anyway. But strategically, it was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think in terms of strategy, it was maybe the most interesting race we've had this season, but it wasn't much to look at in terms of on-track action. Very little overtaking. Ended with the top three as they started. Top four as they started, actually. And yeah, the big talking points, none of them have anything to do with anything that actually occurred on track.
No, it was all these kind of hypothetical strategies that we were just sort of waiting to watch being played out. But it eventually, inevitably, I suppose, led to a Hamilton victory. I think that that's certainly what most of us predicted at the beginning because he was on pole, but maybe actually didn't, as the race got going, Verstappen taking the lead. But I think today Hamilton's victory was not just a Hamilton victory. This was a Mercedes and Hamilton victory. I think the fact that
Mercedes
they had
minus one very notable second driver.
yeah, who we will again mention later on. I think it was a masterstroke that they had the foresight to know that they needed that extra set of mediums. I know that comes from Lewis's experience of the track, and of course the team as well. But to know that they would need that at some point, and then for it to come into play was great. Then also during the race, when Hamilton ended up behind Verstappen, they pitted him. It was a bit of a surprise pit stop, really, and I really liked that pit stop because they forced Red Bull into making they backed them into a corner, really, and there wasn't much they could do. And I think that was just brilliant teamwork. And then again, the pace that Lewis had at the end, just showing his class. So it was, from that perspective, it was a team victory today.
Yeah, it was a strategic masterstroke from the guys at Mercedes, wasn't it? Once Hamilton came in for those new tyres, either they had to get Verstappen immediately in and hope it all worked out, which it didn't after the first round of pit stops, or they had to hope that they had the beans left to get going, which obviously, despite the best efforts of Nikita Mazepin and Valtteri Bottas, they didn't.
And I think Verstappen and Red Bull did all they could today. Verstappen did what he needed to do at the start of the race. He took the lead. He took it very forcefully. He stuck out those elbows into turn one and ploughed on. He was flying in the first couple of laps until Lewis, got to grips maybe with the tyres or the car and started to reel him back in a little bit. But I think the fact that
sorry, go on.
I think the fact that Max got a great start and passed Lewis at turn one, I think that transformed the race, because I think if Lewis had made it into turn one first, it would have been a bit of a procession. So I'm very glad that Verstappen got ahead.
I think that Verstappen's a really fast starter, not just off the grid, but you saw it at Imola as well now. It sometimes takes Hamilton 2 or 3 laps just to get the car running as he wants it, whereas Verstappen's able to grab it by the neck, drag it into the lead as early on as possible, and put up a fight that he probably shouldn't be putting up, if I'm honest. I think that's the difference there, isn't it? He did it again today. It didn't work long term. And I know Verstappen himself said as soon as he heard that Hamilton had gone in for another set of tyres, he knew he'd lost the race. But the fact that he was able to do it is indicative of what a brilliant job he's doing this season.
He was in contention for the win for the whole time. Even when it looked like the strategy, they'd been beaten on strategy, he was still out front and he was still holding on to that place. And, he kept his distance from Bottas as well. But I think that I don't think anyone else other than Max Verstappen could have done what he did today in that Red Bull. And so it's really now becoming very obvious, I think, just how good Max Verstappen is. And I do think that competing with Hamilton like this during this season is only going to make him an even better driver in the coming years, and have an even greater chance of winning multiple world championships. This level of competition that he has with Hamilton is really going to benefit him in the future.
Yes, yeah, I think this is the learning phase where Verstappen perfects his racecraft, which we are seeing. I think I'm struggling to think of many real errors Verstappen's made this season. The track limits thing, arguable.
Many drivers have done that.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's a new aspect to F1 we haven't really seen before, track limits.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something to get the grips with. But you don't see him doing what he was doing even last season, where he's coming in a bit too strong, flying off at the first corner, clipping the wall and losing all the points because he's crashed out. He's always there. And I mean, he'll feel terrible that he hasn't won today. But second, first, second is not a bad set of results for anybody. It's just unfortunate for him that he's really coming into his powers at the point that Lewis Hamilton is at the peak of his.
I think the only mistake Verstappen has made was the one that he made in Imola under the safety car, and well, he won that race. So it's obviously going to show that he is maturing. And I think as well, he's not throwing these kind of hissy fits either after races or even during, like over the radio. He's still firm and he's still, loud, but a lot of the F1 drivers are. He's not the only one. That level of petulance is draining away. We might see it pop up every now and then. When he really feels wronged, but at the moment he's just keeping his head, and he knows that he's not got the best car. He knows that Mercedes are still the better team, but at certain racetracks the Red Bull is going to be faster, and I think he's just going to use that to his advantage.
Yeah, if there's one thing I think he's learned from Hamilton, it's that staying calm and just keeping control of the situation is far more valuable than being angry. Sometimes you have to drive aggressively. Sometimes you have to make sure you get your own way. But having a huge full-scale, mein Gott, muss das sein sort of moment isn't going to do him any good in the long run. And just coping with it, being sanguine about it, as he was today. He said, I knew I'd lost it when Hamilton came in for that second stop. As last week, when he found out he'd lost the point for fastest lap, he was pretty relaxed then. It's the best way to deal with it, really. I don't think there's any more improved thing he could do in that regard. And I think that's what's really bringing about the best of Verstappen this year, is that new attitude that's seeing him really, really come to the front as possibly the standout driver of the season.
On the other hand, we have somebody who seems like they really are starting to lose their grip on F1 and the Mercedes seat in Valtteri Bottas. He made some questionable decisions today, one in particular where he held Lewis Hamilton up for no reason. I really couldn't see the logic behind that. And this is not about Hamilton favoritism. We often say on this podcast that we think he's the greatest, but this has nothing to do with that. I think Bottas needs to pick his battles. He didn't need to hold Lewis up. He was never going to hold on to that place anyway. So there was no point in holding him up. He was pitted the next lap anyway. And maybe just pride got the better of him today, and he wanted to, I don't know. I can't see why he did it.
Well, I think Bottas, as you saw quite a lot in his Drive to Survive Series 3 segment, is really keen not to be thought of as a second driver. He wants to be considered a good driver in his own right. And I think he does get upset when team orders are imposed on him. He's not the first high-level driver to have it done to them this season. At Imola, Ricciardo got asked to move over. I suspect, given the way it's gone this season, at some point Sebastian Vettel's going to be asked to move over for Lance Stroll. And
Perez for Verstappen probably at some point as well.
Yeah. I'm sure Perez for Verstappen, if he can get a handle on that car a bit more. But yeah, there are times when you could put up a fight, say if the two cars were well clear, Hamilton was ahead in the championship, you could completely understand him refusing to yield. But when you're forecast to catch somebody on the last lap and you need your teammate to get out of the way so you can get through, that seems to me to be entirely the wrong time to try and show that you are as good a driver as Lewis Hamilton. And I mean, I think Bottas gets a bit of unfair stick. It must be hard being Hamilton's teammate. But there was no way, as you said, he was ever going to win that fight. He wasn't going to come second. He'd had several laps to try and challenge Verstappen. He'd taken 2 seconds off, but that was over about 10 laps. So I don't know why he thought he was going to do anything there, unless he's been promised a second Red Bull seat for next season.
Even in that position, even if Bottas and Hamilton had a similar pace, so even if Bottas was lapping at a pace that he could defend from Hamilton, I would even understand that, because he would think, I've got these tyres, I can make them go to the end, and I've got the pace and I can hold Lewis off, and that's my second place. I would get that. But this was Hamilton was lightning fast because he just put on a new set of tyres, and he wasn't trying to catch Bottas, he was trying to catch Verstappen. So he was absolutely flying, and there was just no chance that Bottas was going to be able to hold him back. And after all that as well, they then pitted him straight after, which I know that they probably didn't expect Bottas to hold Hamilton up, but I think if I was Mercedes, I probably would have brought Bottas in a lap earlier. He lost the position to Charles Leclerc anyway, whether they pitted him in 1 lap before or not. He did obviously get it back. So I think that it was a very strange decision from Bottas. I think maybe Mercedes, with all of their brilliance, with the foresight that they had for the extra set of mediums, they should have just cleared Hamilton's path regardless, because then they wouldn't have had the issue of coming over the radio to Bottas saying, move out of the way. So maybe that would have been a solution. But at the end of the day, it didn't really matter because Hamilton took the lead. But I do think that that's just another little note in Toto Wolff's book regarding Valtteri Bottas.
I don't think they'll do that again now. I think if a similar situation arises, they'll pull Bottas in for the tyre to the fastest lap shot. And I think really Bottas only has himself to blame for that in future, because it must be painful if your team comes on the radio and tells you the guy behind you is on for the win and he's behind you. But it was so clearly the case that Hamilton was flying that I don't understand why you'd want to get in his way. It feels a little bit like, in some ways, what happened to Bottas at Sakhir last year when George Russell filled in the second Mercedes and tried to put up a fight and failed, and just came away from it looking like he was struggling to justify what he was doing. And couple that in with what happened at Imola, and I think we're not the first people on YouTube. So I know Aidan Millwood 3 days ago released a video talking about how there was no way Mercedes were going to snag Bottas, which is definitely true. There is no way Mercedes are going to just leave him in the middle of the season. No. But he must be feeling the pressure for what happens when his contract expires at the end of this year. I assume this is one of the nails in the coffin now, but there's still quite a lot this season to go, so I suppose he could bring it back.
He could bring it back. There's no doubt. He just needs to get himself. He needs to put himself together and sort it out. And you're right. There's no way Mercedes would cause all that disruption just to get him out of the seat when he's still there. He's still picking up the points for Mercedes. He's not challenging Verstappen, but he is still picking up those points for Mercedes. Without the points that he's got so far, Mercedes probably wouldn't be leading the championship. So it's, they won't get rid of him. But I think that there are plenty of the Mercedes are going to look to the future, and they're going to look for these young drivers that are on the grid that are part of their academy program who they can get in. And of course, as well, they might have to look for a Hamilton replacement too. I think that could be a saving grace for Bottas. If Hamilton retires, then potentially they would want to keep Bottas on as the experienced head. Bottas would probably feel released into the fact that he now can attempt to get a world championship because Hamilton has gone. He's got an inexperienced teammate, but Hamilton has said he wants to stay for another year. So who knows what will happen.
Yeah, I think Hamilton will keep going. I think if next year turns out to be a shambles, he might consider retiring. But I wonder if he's trying to be the first guy to get double figures of world championships, which is not
even higher.
Good news if you're Valtteri Bottas in the slightest, is it?
Not at all. Or Verstappen, really.
Yes, true. Coming into your peak as somebody refuses to relinquish theirs is never a nice feeling.
No. So Bottas was passed by Leclerc on the first lap. He did actually get quite a good start, but he was sort of held up by the front two, and Leclerc slipped through. Obviously couldn't. Leclerc was in that position for a long time, He couldn't hold on to it in the end, but I thought he had a great weekend, qualifying fourth and then finishing fourth. I really think he's driving the wheels off that Ferrari. I've been really impressed with his performances so far. If he can keep that up, and maybe Sainz as well could just improve a little bit more, maybe we could see Ferrari challenging for that best of the rest position. I think if that's going to happen, it'll be later on in the season, as in when, they improve and develop the car as it goes through the season. But yeah, special shout out, I think, to Leclerc, who I thought was a very good driver today.
Yeah, I think he's like Norris, 3 seasons in the evolution of the same car means that driver and car are increasingly in harmony, and that is yielding results. I think it's the secret to Norris's decent showings this season, absolutely. And I think why Stroll has been doing better than Vettel, and possibly why Ocon is doing better than Alonso. And it's certainly why Verstappen, apart from the fact Verstappen's a generational talent, he's also been the only consistent thing about the Red Bull team over the last few years. So he really, Leclerc has been in the car for 3 straight seasons. And yeah, he's just improving and improving and improving. And he's a good driver anyway, a really good driver. So I think those 2 things together are really helping him bring the fight. Sainz is doing quite well as well, but it's the new car factor, isn't it? The same thing that's getting to Ricciardo, the same thing that's getting to Vettel. It's just unfamiliarity at the moment. But if they can keep their drive line up for a couple of years, I wouldn't be surprised if Ferrari was dragged back into the title fight by the rule change.
I mean, if we could see him, can you imagine a Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren and Ferrari fight for the championship? I know I'm probably
2010,
being a bit optimistic.
2010 final race. Drivers from all 3 of those teams could have won.
So, it could happen. So other notable things that occurred in the race, obviously the focus was mostly on the front 2. And so whatever was going on near the back maybe was a bit overshadowed. But you wanted to mention again about Daniel Ricciardo and his improvements, I guess, over the last couple of races.
Look at this, a positive Daniel Ricciardo segment from me. What is happening? Yeah, do you know what? I think he had a really good race. He was comfortably the better of the 2. Not sure why that was, but it doesn't really matter because Ricciardo needed to show that he wasn't being left behind. And while he didn't finish miles in front, he did finish in front. He did qualify in front. He did look the better of the 2 drivers. And it was just exactly the result he needed, really. It's the result that Vettel and Alonso are going to need to try and find at some point in the future. But if this is Ricciardo's first big step and he makes a step a couple more times, I fully anticipate him being on the podium this year.
And I agree. I don't know what was going on with Norris today, but he never looked entirely comfortable. He did qualify first in Q1, but obviously there was many a sandbag on the track from the front teams at that time. So he's going to have those kind of weekends, isn't he? And Ricciardo, I think, showing his experience as well to get back up to the field. Yet, like you said, he needed a weekend like that where it was just a solid, consistent result to show that he's there. He deserves that McLaren seat, and he's working to build on it, which is good.
On the flip side of that, of course, you have another holding up a leading driver incident from Mazepin, who apparently conspired with Helmut Marko and Valtteri Bottas to attempt to hand the race to Verstappen unsuccessfully. But rather than going off into a Mazepin-related diatribe, I think it's just worth pointing out that he's still struggling to control the car 4 races in. And I'm still quietly confident that he will be Yuji Ide, and I'd just like to keep that conversation in the public sphere.
I mean, he's finishing races, which is actually, I think, maybe more than we expected from him at this time. But it's that lack of awareness and control, isn't it? I can imagine that he's in the car. He's so busy trying to actually keep the car on the track that he's not even paying attention to what's inevitably flying up behind him, which would be the race leaders. So I can see that that's probably what's going on. He just, maybe after 10 races, 15 races, which is, only not very far into the season, he will have more of a natural, control. of the car, and that will kind of ease it out. I think a lot of people, or certainly within Formula One, are still going quite easy on him in this sense that, he's still new and he's making these mistakes, and that's going to happen, which is fine, until, it puts somebody's life at risk, which might be going a bit too extreme. But, he's not the safest of drivers at the moment.
Yeah. Maybe I'm looking at the 107% time, and actually he was 3.5 seconds inside it. So he's not so woefully slow that he's going to have to ask the stewards to start the race. But he is still 7/10 off his, no more than that, 7/10 off his teammate in similar machinery. While Mick Schumacher, I think, is surprising nearly everyone. Obviously, people expected he'd be good, but I don't think people expected that he'd be doing as well as he's doing this quickly. Which also adds to Mazepin's woes, because if your teammate is beginning to excel, you risk becoming a backmarker edition of Valtteri Bottas, which is not really what anybody, least of all Mazepin and Bottas, want to see happen.
No. So other notable things that I do want to mention Alpine really quickly, because they seem to have improved a little bit. In Portugal, certainly, and then this weekend as well. They had a decent qualifying, but race pace was just nowhere. Alonso dropped like a stone at the end of the race. I don't exactly know why. I don't know whether it was just they didn't have the pace, or whether they didn't manage their tyres very well, or whatever other reason, their strategy just wasn't right. But I wasn't surprised. I'll put it that way.
No, they're threatening to be all right, but struggling. I think a little bit like Renault last season. They're there, but they're not quite where they need to be competitive, and degrading tyres and questionable strategies, which is exactly what Aston Martin are doing this year as well, are costing them points finishes. And yeah, it's not been a stunning set of World Championship results yet. Lance Stroll has flattered for Aston Martin, and I think Ocon has flattered for Alpine. But I would be concerned if I was in charge of either of those teams.
Yeah, definitely. They're not quite well. Maybe Alpine are, but Aston, as we've mentioned in previous podcasts, certainly aren't performing as we expected them to. And so a couple of more people that I'd like to just point out. Gasly, I thought, had a really good race, considering that he got himself a penalty for stopping way far more forward than his grid position, which was, you don't see that too often in F1. So he got a 5-second penalty for that, and still had a really good race. So I was quite impressed with how he managed that. In fact, he still came 10th, so he got his 1 point right at the end. And but Tsunoda had a completely dismal weekend. He retired today early on, caused a safety car as well. He then yesterday had a poor qualifying session, and sort of blamed, or sort of said that him and Gasly weren't getting the same deal in terms of the car and things like that, which he did then later apologize for saying in his anger. But yeah, so he's having a few difficult weekends now, which is maybe closer to what we were expecting from him. He just needs to keep his head and push on, because he's good enough to have better race weekends than he's having at the moment.
Yeah, he is, and he's doing okay, isn't he? The 2 points from 9th in his first race definitely help. Sits him above both Alphas, both Williams, both Haas's, and Sebastian Vettel. But yeah, you kind of, after that brilliant start at Bahrain, you really feel you want to see more. Tsunoda was unlucky at Imola. I'm sure it'll come together for him. He's doing, certainly for a first season, he's not doing badly. Like Terriere, he's ahead of both Kimi and Giovinazzi. Vettel at this point, you sort of expect it, sadly, but he's doing okay. It's just with experience will come more points, and if Gasly is getting the better end of limited resources, I suspect that's because Gasly won a race last season, and Tsunoda has finished 9th once. But hopefully, as Tsunoda becomes more comfortable in the car, because he isn't looking wild, he isn't looking like Mazepin or Perez at times, who also seems to be struggling a little bit with the machinery this year. He is looking relatively composed. It's just partly been bad luck.
I do think we have to bear in mind as well that he's the youngest driver on the grid, and like he's coming from a part of the world where he hasn't had much practice on European racetracks. That was something you mentioned very early on in our podcast this season. So he's going to have these moments. I really hope that that AlphaTauri stick with him, because I think that he's a talent. I think he's one of the most talented drivers to take that AlphaTauri seat in a while. Certainly, when I say talented, I mean kind of previously talented and then coming into that seat and showing that he is talented, rather than a driver getting into it and then being very raw and kind of having to develop all the way up, maybe a bit like Gasly and Kvyat. So I'm still impressed with him. He's just got to try and sort it out. My final shout out for this weekend would be to Kimi Raikkonen. I thought he had a great race. He finished 12th, obviously not in the points, but not far off. And he was in contention for some points near the end, after being the only one to start on the medium tyres. So I think, he's 40 years old, 41 years, however old he is, he's still got it.
Yeah, I mean, experience is helping him in the twilight of his career, isn't it? Now he's down amongst more or less exclusively new drivers in a not particularly competitive car. He's effectively just driving for fun. He is using all of the experience just to pull out those little bits, and it sees him doing all right. I'm sure he'll be looking to get his first points on the board this season, which still hasn't happened yet. But he's not in bad company, really. The only person who finished below him that has scored points this season is Fernando Alonso anyway. So he's leading the sort of back marker, back of the midfield pack. And you still look at him and you still expect things from him. And will he be doing much more next season, the season after? I'm still not really sure. But he's showing that an old dog doesn't necessarily need to learn new tricks to keep doing all right. And I'm sure that Alfa Romeo are still comparatively happy, because while Giovinazzi is pushing him, there were these Raikkonen moments that he comes out with, which just mean as everybody else is starting to struggle, he's there to pick up the points, pick up the pieces, and get through.
And it was a bit of a retribution for last weekend's race as well, where he was the only retirement. And you wanted to mention George Russell specifically, but it was a decent weekend for Williams, 14th and 16th finishes. But you think Russell maybe should have done a bit better?
I don't know if it was him as much, but a few laps from the end there, he was within 0.4 of Alonso, and I thought, this is it. He's finally going to get the points. Hamilton's had this brilliant strategic win, but the real story is going to be points in a Williams. And then, as it sometimes does, or usually does, it all just sort of fell apart, and he ended up sliding down the order, fought back to 14th, because I think he got down as 16th at one point. But yeah, it's still not happening for George, and I just want to see him get the points.
It will come. I have no doubt it will come this season. I don't think the last couple of racetracks have been what Williams need. Williams need a racetrack that perfectly suits their car, and then a little bit of luck on top of that. So
could it be Monaco?
That's a tough one, because this is the thing. George Russell is a brilliant over one lap. So if he can get a brilliant quali lap in Monaco and just hold that position, maybe that's the weekend.
That would be good. I mean, I don't think there's many other tracks where he could achieve that, because I think, as you say, that great one lap and then the natural confines of Monaco to keep people behind him. If he can make it through to either the very top end of Q2 or like Q3, I think he'll be doing okay. He might have to rely on a mistake here and there. Watching Nikita Mazepin block the track at some point in the race will probably help him as well. But yeah, I just want to see him get those points now. I know he's officially scored points, but even that felt like a horrible letdown cop-out.
Yeah,
despite the first. Oh, absolutely. So we'll see, I guess. 2 weeks.
Well, speaking of Monaco, It is in 2 weeks' time, and that is when we will be back with our next Eau Rouge podcast. And obviously, Monaco, a little bit of a procession normally, but it can throw up a good race here or there. If it rains, especially, who knows? And of course, like you said, we could have Mazepin blocking the entire track for the race, which would certainly provide some entertainment, if not a bit of danger. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. And please hit like, subscribe, and do write some comments in there. We'd love to hear what you have to say, and we'll include it in future podcasts as well. Certainly if we think it's a controversial opinion or if it's something we disagree with. But thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.